This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to discuss labor market regulation in the United States. It might surprise you to know that approximately 1 in 5 jobs in the United States require workers to get a license from the state before they can enter their chosen profession. On the second half of the show, we'll talk about the growth of occupational licensure and the impact it has on workers and consumers around the country. But first, we're going to discuss a labor market regulation that's discussed in almost every Economics 101 class in the country, but that is still widely debated in public policy circles: the minimum wage. The debate over the minimum wage has been reinvigorated after Seattle adopted a $15 an hour minimum wage, and other cities and states are beginning to follow suit. My first guest is one of the economists on the forefront of the debate surrounding Seattle's minimum wage, Dr. Jacob Vigdor. Dr. Vigdor is the Daniel J. Evans Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's start, because I said Econ 101, and if viewers out there have taken a class, they've seen this. What's the basic first economist pass at the economics of a minimum wage?
Well, one of the basic principles of economics is that as anything gets more expensive, people want to buy less of it. So in the labor market, it's businesses that are buying time from people. And when we think that there's a higher price for that time because of a minimum wage, we think that businesses will want to hire fewer workers at this higher wage. So it should result in a reduction in employment.
Right, because it's not like when workers become more productive, then employers can afford to pay them more. In this case, the price is just coming out of nowhere.
That's right. It's a difference between a worker working harder and being able to earn more per hour versus a business being forced to pay more per hour for the same productivity.
So if all of us economists teach this, and I've seen Paul Krugman's old textbook, it says the same thing, but yet I see him write columns that say, hey, increasing the minimum wage is a good idea. Usually all these textbooks say it's going to cause unemployment among the least skilled. What do some economists who favor a minimum wage think about this? What is their reasoning?
There's a debate over, okay, it's going to reduce employment, but by how much? Maybe just a little bit, maybe a lot. And I think there have been quite a few studies that have suggested that the employment losses are actually pretty small. And so you're actually putting more money in workers' pockets. Yeah, maybe their hours get cut back. Maybe it's a little bit harder to find work, but it's not so bad.
I think this is an important distinction that you make, because the Econ 101 textbooks just talk about what's efficient for the economy that counts everybody equally and says it makes us poorer. What advocates are doing is they're cutting out lots of people then and saying, let's focus just on the workers this applies to, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a real focus on a certain subset of the workforce here, but I think that one of the concerns that we have is that a higher minimum wage is going to deliver some benefits to some workers, but then you're going to have other groups that find it's become much more difficult to find work.
Right, but the economists who favor this aren't claiming that this on net makes Seattle or the United States wealthier. It's more about we get poorer, but there's some people we care about who benefit more. Is that?
Yeah, so if you listen to what advocates say about the minimum wage, people will point out that there are record corporate profits in the United States, and this is a matter of fairness. This is about redistributing profits from businesses to workers' wages. The challenge being that these low-wage workers are not necessarily working for the big profitable companies like Apple Computer or the big Wall Street banks. They're working for smaller businesses where there's not so many profits to go around.
Right. And the first part that you said is, yeah, we know from the law of demand that as we raise price, quantity demand is going to go down. But by how much? Most people don't advocate raising a minimum wage to $50 an hour or something absurd like that because they realize lots of people will lose jobs. Usually it's always tinkered with on these margins where it's not going to affect that many people. Seattle seems to start to be an outlier on this. Can you tell us about Seattle's ordinance and how that's different from the way states usually kind of tinker with the minimum wage?
Yeah, usually you see the minimum wage go up by 50 cents or $1 at a time. So back in 2014, Seattle had a minimum wage of about $9.50 an hour, and they decided to take it all the way to $15. So that's like a $5.50 increase. They were going to phase it in over a few years, but if you look from the beginning of 2015 to the beginning of 2016, they took the minimum wage from about $9.50 to $13 an hour for the largest companies. And so that's a $3.50 increase over just a year.
And it was followed up by another one after that, wasn't it?
Yep, and it's continued to go up. So right now, the biggest businesses in Seattle are actually required to pay $15.45 an hour.
Well, meanwhile, the federal minimum across the country is still what? 7 something?
$7.25.
So you've done a number of studies on Seattle. What was the one that you did about a year ago on that first phase in? What did you find when you investigated this?
Sure. Yeah, we have data that allow us to track the workforce and see who's being employed for which wages in Seattle and in the rest of Washington state. What we found is that when the city raised the minimum wage to $13 an hour back in 2016, we actually saw wages go up by about 3%, but hours were cut back by more than that. It's more on the order of 6 or 7% that we're finding there. So what we're discovering is that businesses are cutting back on labor so much that workers are actually going home with less money in their pockets.
This is an interesting point because a lot of people ask, well, how many people got unemployed? And what you're saying is actually the reduction for the workers came a different way.
That's right. It's not just, you have to understand that most low-wage jobs are part-time jobs. They average about 27 hours a week. So if you're thinking about, well, how do employers adjust when the wages go up, it's not necessarily that they'll lay people off. It's that someone who is getting 25 hours a week might now just be getting 20 hours a week.
And the net result, coupled with the wage increase, what you found is they became poorer.
Yeah, when we take the entire low-wage labor market, there's less money going to the workers in that market.
And you've started to look beyond that now. I know in really hot off the press study that you've been doing, you start to decompose the workers and look at different segments. What do you look at in that?
Yeah, what we're looking at now, we have the ability to look back at workers' histories. How long have they been working and what wages have they been earning in the past? So we'd look to see, is there a difference between experienced workers and inexperienced workers? And we're finding that there is. We're finding that if you're an experienced worker, if you're the sort of person who has worked for quite a long time, for a few years, let's say, in the low-wage labor market, then employers are hanging on to workers like that. Who are they letting go? They're letting go the less experienced workers. And so we're seeing this divide where there's a group of more experienced workers that are coming out ahead by maybe an average of $10 a week as a result of these minimum wage increases. But then it's the less experienced workers that are losing out.
You know, that's interesting because kind of when we dial back to what's the economist's rationale for this, who would say it might be a good idea, if they're excluding the welfare of consumers and profits and so, it's for some sort of philosophical idea that the least well-off matter more. But now when we start to decompose that least well-off group, it's the better off of the least well-off who win under this and the least well-off of them who lose, if I understand you correctly.
Well, we kind of, there's more information that we need to learn. So one thing that we think, so some people will refer to these low-wage jobs as dead-end jobs, that people go into this type of employment and they're in it for life. And then for another type of story about the low-wage labor market is it's the first rung on the ladder. You get your first job and then you move up to higher paying jobs pretty rapidly. So it could be the case that the people who have been sitting there in the low-wage labor market for years and years, those are the people for whom this job is a dead end. And maybe it's a dead end because they don't have a whole lot of education, they don't have a lot of skills, maybe they have some other sorts of problems that prevent them from moving up. And maybe these people who are kind of newcomers to the labor market, maybe they are the more upwardly mobile types. We're going to need to track these workers longer over time to sort of figure out what's what.
You know, that raises another question because you were looking at workers who had a job when this comes in and finding long-term ones stay, shorter-term ones suffer more. What about the ones who weren't in the market but otherwise would be getting on that kind of first rung of the ladder to start climbing?
Yeah. That's a bit of a challenge for us because if you never get a job, then we don't see you in our data because you have to be employed to show up. But what we see when we look at Seattle and count up how many people are showing up in the data for the first time, that has actually started to decline. So we see firsthand evidence that for people who don't have any prior experience, it's become harder to find that first job in Seattle.
You know, as I think, you know, economists were always thinking about, well, what can you substitute into the production process? So in this case, labor became more expensive. It would seem like the least skilled minimum wage labor would be the short-term employment or the new entries. Their most obvious short-run substitute would be other unskilled that's just a little bit more skilled. And that seems to be what you're finding.
That's right. The big experience, the big differentiator is whether you know the job. So suppose that you run a restaurant and your dishwasher quits. So you're looking for someone to wash dishes. It's a job that requires just a little bit of training on the job, but now you're looking to see, okay, I can go hire somebody with no experience at this job, but I have to pay him $15 an hour. Or if for a couple bucks more, I can go hire somebody who has experience as a dishwasher. They don't need to be trained. They can get straight to work. And they are going for that more experienced worker.
Yeah, and so, I mean, this is still a new law, so all of your effects are short-run effects. When I think about substitutes in the long run, it might not just be other low-skill workers. In fact, there's other things that could substitute for even more skilled, low-skill workers, right?
Sure. Yeah, and we see all kinds of examples of restaurants and other types of businesses making other kinds of decisions that make them less reliant on labor overall, whether that means getting chopped vegetables from their supplier instead of getting vegetables that have to be chopped in their kitchen. There are all sorts of little tweaks to the business model that help you scale back your labor.
Yeah, and everybody's seen the kiosks where you scan yourself out and things like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. The mobile app. I give lots of talks to audiences. I ask them if they have the Starbucks app on their phones. A lot of people have it, and people really love it. And what does that do? It really reduces the need to employ people at the store.
So in our last kind of minute here then, having studied Seattle in depth of what's going on there, states and other cities are starting to think about emulating it. What lessons do you think you have for the rest of the United States, or even us here in the Republic of Texas?
I'd say to this conventional wisdom that says, hey, maybe there aren't so many losses of jobs when you raise the minimum wage, I think that our work kind of calls that into question a little bit and says you have to be careful, especially if you're going to go about raising the minimum wage in these large leaps like what Seattle has done. I think that there are more places doing it. There are more studies that are going to be coming out from places like Minneapolis that are going to $15 an hour. But you have to think about if your goal is to improve the economic fortunes of low-skilled workers and you're thinking that this is the way to do it, you might want to take a step back and think about your other options, like finding people better education and training.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Jake.
All right. You bet. Thanks, Ben.
What do hairdressers, coffin salesmen, medical doctors, and rain dancers all have in common? Stick around to find out.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Daniel Smith. Dr. Smith is an associate professor of economics at Middle Tennessee State University, where he's also the director of the Political Economy Research Institute. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ben. Glad to be here.
So I want to talk to you today about this massive amount of labor market regulation that flies under the screen of lots of economists. People talk about minimum wages and unions, but really occupational licensure is now a major way labor markets in the United States are regulated. First, just tell us, what is occupational licensure?
Occupational licensure is a requirement from government that you have a permission slip to go to work. So you have to get approved by a state board that is controlled by the industry. And usually they have requirements such as educational requirements. You have to apply, do an application, go through a background check, pay in fees, take examination. So a whole variety of different requirements that they place on you to gain admittance to that profession.
Right, and this is different than like going to a certified public accountant, because you could go to an uncertified. The license, you have to have it or you can't be it.
Absolutely. There's no room if you're going to practice. In fact, you could be sued, you could be thrown in jail if you're practicing without that license.
So what's the rationale for it? Why does the government say it needs to regulate these occupations?
The rationale is that it protects consumer safety, and particularly in fields such as your medical doctor, where they have expertise and you don't. There's what economists call information asymmetry, where they have more information about your diagnosis than you do, so they could prescribe services you don't need. Or even more concerningly, they could not have the appropriate credentials to be offering those services in the first place.
All right. So how is this spread in the United States then? How regulated are occupations? How many occupations are regulated?
So overall in the United States, over 1,000 different types of occupations are licensed, but most states don't license all of those occupations. For a particular state, and most occupational licensing is done at the state level, though some is done at the federal level, such as airline pilots, or at the local level. Most is at the state level. You see anywhere from around 60 at the low end of some states, all the way up to around 200 different licensed occupations in each state.
Up to 200, but yet we get 1,000 different ones nationally. This is starting to raise some suspicions already. And how many workers does this affect then?
So it used to, and back in 1950, it only affected about 1 in 20 workers. It was mainly medical doctors, accountants, lawyers, and that has expanded to include now about 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, depending on what estimate you're looking at. I'd probably go with 1 in 4. That's what the U.S. Census uses. So 1 in 4 American workers are now have to get a license in order to go to work. And that's not the increase. It's not from more people entering those professions. It's from the expansion of occupational licensing to increasingly more professions.
So why are so many getting regulated that weren't regulated before? Did these informational, where all of a sudden there are more professions where consumers don't have enough information to evaluate the services?
Well, the justification for occupational licensing is that it's going to protect consumer safety. It's actually most of the argument for licensing a profession often comes from the industry itself. And that's because it offers some benefits to those in the licensed industry in terms of keeping out workers. Because if they can say you have to have a license to enter into this profession, they can artificially restrict entry into the profession, restricting occupational choice and mobility, raise industry wages, and thereby get more pay, take-home pay. And this is all done through occupational licensure. So while it's intended to protect consumers, the industry can actually use it to fleece consumers.
Yeah, so it's restricting the supply of whatever profession it is, and that's going to jack up price. So what are some of these educational requirements and other entry requirements like for, not medicine or something like that, but like barbers or hairdressers and things like that?
It will actually shock you. In most states, it actually takes more education. You have to take more exams to become a cosmetologist or a barber than to become an EMT. So these are pretty stark, and they vary between states. In some states, to be a mortuary, it's just 12 months of education. In some states, it's 4 years of education. So it's a wide degree of variation in what the requirements are.
4 months versus 4 years to be an undertaker. And barbers, I mean, how are we not judge of quality or excess services?
And if you get a bad haircut, the cost to consumer is walking down the street to the next barber and getting a different haircut from a different barber. So it's hard to see the justification. And in some states like Alabama, they went for 25 years without any licensure of barbers, and then just implemented it recently in the last couple of years with 0 complaints on record of consumers complaining that they got a bad haircut and they needed this licensure to protect them.
Yeah, confession, guys. I have an occupational license. I've got a Massachusetts realtor's license that I got back when I was going to college, and I still renew it every 2 years. But I remember when I sat through the courses for it, it was a bunch of education. Then as soon as I started practicing real estate, you didn't use any of it. It was all just a barrier to prevent other people from getting the license.
Mm-hmm. And that's a growing concern, especially and you're seeing this across states with like African hair braiding. It's not included in cosmetology school, and yet people that do African hair braiding oftentimes still have to go through cosmetology school, which is a huge expense. Sometimes $15,000, $20,000, takes a year of their life away from productive work. And it doesn't provide any useful skills that they're going to use in administering their chosen profession.
This is a good point that you're bringing up, because before you mentioned how the licensing can lead to higher prices to fleece consumers. But what impact does it have on the labor market side, particularly for minorities or poorer people trying to get into professions then?
I think that is the most concerning thing about occupational licensing, is that it restricts occupational choice and mobility, especially on vulnerable segments of the society, like minority groups such as women and African Americans, military service members who are forced to move around from base to base to different states, and also criminals that are trying to rehabilitate themselves and integrate themselves into the workforce, trying to be good citizens and earn an honest living after serving their time. They find it hard because these occupational licensing requirements often prevent them from gaining employment, because they restrict anyone that has a criminal record from performing those professions.
You mentioned the military and mobility, but this occurs to me that I've seen other studies that I think is debated among economists of what's happening to income mobility in the United States. And I think of, we have a a dynamic labor market with more than 300 million people across a huge area. How is this impacting that?
Certainly, interstate migration is impacted by occupational licensing, the time requirements. I recently just moved from Alabama to Tennessee. My wife took, it was 4 months by the time she submitted her application to when she's approved by the board. And fortunately, we were wealthy enough that we could afford for her not to work during those 4 months. But the average American, they can't afford to wait 4 months to get to work once moving.
And what type of license was that?
She's a physical therapist. So she had a doctorate degree already from the University of Michigan, which you would think would already demonstrate that she has command of her field. But she had to go through the whole process again and get recertified in Tennessee.
So there's no reciprocity between states on most of these?
No. So some states, there is reciprocity to some varying degrees, but fields like physical therapy, oftentimes they require you to take a law degree specific to that state, but they're pretty standard across the states. And even if they have reciprocity, it still takes a couple months for usually for the paperwork to go through.
So in these more than 1,000 occupations that are licensed, given the criteria of potentially fleecing the consumers because they don't understand the market well, what's the most absurd licensing that you've seen?
Some of my favorite are shampooers. So anyone can shampoo their hair at home, but if you go to a cosmetologist to have your hair done, or you go to a barber to have your hair cut, you have to have someone licensed, at least in some states, to have your hair shampooed. Other examples that are shocking are...
What the heck can they teach you about how much shampoo to put in the hair?
It's clear, I think, to any reasonable person that there's no justification in terms of consumer safety for regulating something like that with a license. Other good examples include florists that are licensed in some states, interior designers, and one of my favorites is tree surgeons. To go cut a tree in many states, you have to have a license, which there's no consumer involved. Usually it's someone cutting a tree out in the middle of the woods where the only one they're going to hurt is themselves. So I think they already have an incentive to follow some standard safety protocols.
These are absurd, but I'll do you one better. Arizona licenses rain dancers.
That is shocking.
I guess to ensure quality and make sure it rains afterwards.
I'd like to see the justification for that one.
So as we have the last few minutes here, what are some alternatives? Because they're clearly, so there's these absurd things that are clearly just occupations keeping people out to get their wages up. But there are places where there's concern about information differences between consumers and producers. What are some alternatives to licensure of how markets might be able to deal with this?
Absolutely. In the private market, anytime consumers are skeptical or uncertain about the quality of a good or service, that's a profit opportunity for someone to say, hey, I can get more business if I can assure my customers of the safety of this. Great example I always use is Brown-Forman, the whiskey distiller. They had a huge problem with general store owners cutting their whiskey with water. And so they introduced the first bourbon manufacturer in the United States to introduce glass bottles that were sealed to assure customers of that safety. Well, if you think about it, in the private market, you have private certification. So it's not necessarily a mandated license, but you can go get privately certified. So EMTs in Mississippi are privately certified. You can have advertising, insurance. Insurance companies don't want to insure a medical doctor that is going to engage in malpractice or isn't sufficiently qualified to administer care. You could have warranties. The reputation of stores, chain stores are well known for taking back merchandise. So there's a wide range. You can get second opinions. There's Yelp, consumer ratings. There's a wide range of institutions in addition to normal courts, right? Even without occupational licensing, someone engaging in fraud, malpractice, or negligence can still be sued in the court of law and be held liable. So there's a lot of institutions that
good housekeeping seal of approval, consumer reports, all of these type of things could do part of this job. In fact, I'm struck as you're talking about, especially as you mentioned Yelp, occupational licensure has been exploding at precisely the time that information is getting easier to access to see quality with the internet.
That is an irony that I don't think anyone has appreciated. That's pretty insightful.
So last few seconds for states looking to reform, what are practical steps that they could do right now to ease the burden of occupational licensure to help consumers and help people enter professions?
Number one, strict review process for any new extension of occupational licensing to new occupations. Number two, review what's currently licensed and compare it to what other states are doing to ensure that they're not disproportionately out of line with what the other states require without consumer safety problems.
And maybe 3, reciprocity.
Absolutely. That would definitely help to reduce the burden on workers and consumer choice.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Dan.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Well, on today's show, we heard about 2 types of labor market regulation in the United States. One that virtually everybody knows about, the minimum wage, and the other, occupational licensure, that flies under the radar screen for most people, at least in proportion to how big it is in the United States. But what both of these things have in common is they disproportionately impact lower skill, lower income workers. The minimum wage sets a price for it in the hopes of raising the wages of these workers. But prices play a key role in coordinating any economy, and when you control them through price controls like a minimum wage, that messes up the market's process of coordination and, as our first guest indicated, often harms some of the very workers that it's intended to help. Meanwhile, occupational licensure that's supposed to ensure quality often does nothing to improve quality, but meanwhile regulates lots of low-skilled people out of professions that they're perfectly capable of providing, but they don't have the resources to jump through the state hoops in order to get the license to practice the job. I think our economy and the least well-off among us would be better if both of these things were gotten rid of. I'll see you next time.